Hey, welcome back. So when we left off, we had just managed to put a year-to-date revenue measure alongside a monthly breakout of revenue in our Power Pivot table. But there was one problem. Our measure is causing rows to be added to our pivot table for months that we don't even have data for, because it's still valid to say that there is a year-to-date total for those months. So how do we get rid of this dead weight from our pivot table? Well, the first step is to think about why, specifically, we don't want these rows in our pivot table. And that's because we don't have any actual revenue for those months. So what we need then is some way to get our newest measure, our revenue year-to-date measure, to return a blank if the revenue measure is blank. If you think that sounds like conditional logic, you'd be correct. But we need our logical condition to test whether the revenue measure is blank for a given set of coordinates in our pivot. That is to say, for a given year and month in this case. And that's where DAX's ISBLANK function comes in. ISBLANK returns true at a certain set of coordinates in a pivot, that is to say, a specific intersection of row headers, column headers, and filters, if the measure or calculation we provide it is blank for those coordinates. So now we can use this function to test whether our revenue measure is returning blank, and if so, make our year-to-date revenue measure return blank as well. So now that we know about the ISBLANK function, let's use it to refactor our year-to-date revenue measure so that we only see it for months where we had actual revenue. So our first step, of course, will be to click our Power Pivot tab and then go into our measures and then choose Manage Measures because we're actually going to be editing an existing measure. And now looking down the list, I see our revenue year-to-date measure, so I'll click that to select it and then click Edit. And now that we have our formula for the measure up, I can modify this to incorporate our ISBLANK logic. And the logic is pretty straightforward. We simply want our formula to read, if the revenue measure is blank, return a blank. Otherwise, return the calculation that we see here, the calculation that gave us our revenue year-to-date measure to begin with. So before our calculate, I'll type if, and then the ISBLANK function, and then for the single argument to ISBLANK, I'll pass the expression that we're testing to see whether or not it's blank, which is our revenue measure. And then I'll close out that parenthesis. And then if that condition is true, if the revenue measure is indeed blank for a given set of coordinates in our pivot, we just want to return the value blank. And then if that condition isn't true, which is to say there is a value for our revenue measure for a given month in our pivot, we'll just return the measure we already had written to begin with. So now we'll add a final closing parenthesis at the very end to close out our if, and then click OK. And then we'll close out of our Manage Measures dialog box to see the results. And now if we scroll down to the bottom of our pivot table, drum roll please, we got exactly the result we were looking for. We see our year-to-date revenues all the way through the last month we have data for, but all those rows with no revenue and the same repeated values for year-to-date revenue are gone. Now, I don't want to convey the impression here that the ISBLANK function is only useful for this exact scenario. In fact, it's a very versatile function that you can use in all sorts of ways, but the general application is going to look something like this. Typically, you'll be using it to make sure that your measure returns blank if some other thing is blank or some condition is true, and otherwise just return the measure. Okay. After this little diversion into the ISBLANK function, up next we'll wade back into the realm of DAX time intelligence functions and explore a function that lets us compare different time frames side by side in a single pivot with ease. I'll see you then.